PAC negative black wire goes to the controller B minus connection. The red PAC positive goes to the contactor plus A1, and the enable also goes to the contactor plus A1. They share that terminal post. What the enable wire does is it turns on the DC to DC converter when the contactor is on. So when the switch is on, the car is turned on, or when the car is charging. This allows the DC to DC converter to charge while the vehicle is on or while it's charging. Remember that the battery is going to go into position, so we need to route the cable around it through the cable runs and over to the contactor. So just fit every cable in nice and neat, go back around to the contactor, and then we'll put the two connections onto the positive side of the main contactor. So we'll put these two red wires onto the plus A1 terminal on the main contactor. And the black cable goes to controller B minus. And let's take another close-up look at the terminal positions on our controller so we can be reminded of where they are. This is a larger spade on the bottom portion of the face of the controller. Next, we're going to finish up the common ground points in our system. These two black wires go to the isolated ground in the control box. They're labeled as such. One goes to the 12-volt battery and one goes to the DIN rail. And the one that goes to the 12-volt battery has the thicker connection, the largest connection on the common ground. So we're going to put that as the first cable onto the common ground. Everything else will go on top of it. When attaching wires to a common point, you want to make sure that the wire containing the most current is the closest to the source. So that's why we put the thickest wire on the bottom and then arrange the other wires according to the gauge of the wire and connections above it. And then we can tighten up our common ground, and this will complete the points that all get assembled to this common isolated ground point. You can spread these wires out a little bit too, fan them out a little bit so that they fit nice and snugly down on the common ground, and then tighten it up. Now let's take a look at the other end of these negative wires we've connected to the common ground. The one going to the DIN rail goes to a fused position, number 23 on the DIN rail. Notice that the smaller numbers 1 through 20 are smaller, just straight through connections. 21, 22, and 23, however, are fused connections. So if we pop open these 21, 22, and 23 spots on the DIN rail with the fuses, we can see how the fuses fit in. But you also need to pop it up to tighten the wire down. So you'll see the screw connection here. So insert your negative cable into spot number 23 and tighten it down into place. We'll add the fuses into the DIN rail at a later point in the assembly process. Next, we're going to go back to the charger relay, and we have a small jumper cable that goes between terminals number 1 and 8 on the charger relay. What this does is it enables the fan and the blue light to come on the dashboard when the charger is on. So we're going to put this little jumper cable into place, and we're going to start by inserting position number 8 on the charger relay. So we make this connection the same way we've made all of our other connections on the relay post. And we'll finish tightening that up. The other connection on relay position 1, charger relay 1, is a shared connection. We have another cable that comes from the 12-volt auxiliary battery positive side and goes to the charger relay position 1. So we'll put in our small jumper cable and share it with this larger cable coming from the 12-volt battery. And we'll just make that 12-volt battery connection on top and tighten these two wires down to the charger relay. This finishes up our connections on this side of the charger relay. We have a couple more on the other side, a couple more posts. One goes to charger relay position number 4. So we'll connect this connection down, and then the other end of this wire circles over to fused position number 22 on the DIN rail. Just as a note, we will have one open position on the charger relay. You can see it here. There's one connection that's not made on the charger relay of the 8. So we can loop that wire around and tighten it into place in position number 22. Fuse position 21 has a purple wire that goes from the fused position 21 to the auxiliary battery. We'll connect to position number 21 and then route the wire towards the auxiliary battery positive side. Just an automotive note on these last two cables, last two wires we've connected. The purple wire is the always-on power from the 12-volt battery. So we always have auxiliary power from the purple. It's an always-on wire. Whereas the red wire from the 12-volt battery is the switched 12-volt power. So that power is only on when the key switch is turned on. So that's how wires go in through the DIN rail on fuse positions number 21 and 22. Now we can install our charger relay into its receptacle. You'll notice that the 8 pins match up with the 8 pin openings in the receptacle, but there's also a key slot that lines up, so you can only put this relay in the correct way. It only fits in one way. You just push it into place and it fits in and does its job to switch between different components in our system. So we've wired up our charger relay and completed that circuit inside the high voltage control enclosure. Okay, moving on, we have our 12-volt transformer. One part of the power cord just plugs into the back of the transformer. The other parts of the cord connect to the receptacle plug, the plug receptacle where we plug in from the AC power. There are 3 connections here, black, green, and white. We're using the smaller of these connections, and you just match them up by color and make the connections. They just plug in. You can't plug in the small to the large. It just doesn't fit. So there's really no way to get this wrong. Just make sure you match up the colors. And you can now remove the adhesive tape covers and adhere the transformer to the bottom of the high voltage control box. We'll now connect the charger to the AC plug. There are 3 wires that now go to the other side of the charger plug, the larger terminals. These connect by color just like the first 3 did. But one end of these 3 wires goes to the charger and one end goes to the AC plug. So we'll just match them up by color and plug them in on the AC plug side first. Then we're going to route the 3 charger wires over to the other side of the box. These are the last wires that go into the cable runs, the stays that hold the cables in place on the sides of the box. So if you want to, you can squeeze these shut. You can even seal them shut by bolting them shut. I'll leave that up to your instructor to tell you and guide you on that. So you can just work your way across and route the cables through the cable stays and make sure everything's neat and tidied up as we get towards the end of our wiring of the assembly here. So those 3 wires that we've just connected to the AC plug will remain near this opening in the high voltage box. We have a wire loom that comes in from the front of the vehicle, and these will make connections with that wire loom when it's assembled in the vehicle. So you've got everything routed through the stays and holders on the inside of the box, on the edges of the box. Now would be a good time to clean up the wiring in the middle, in the center of the box. You can use some zip ties on little bundles of wire as they go through and around the components, just to make sure everything's neatly routed and you don't have any stray wires running underneath components or where they shouldn't be. And you can zip tie some of these together. We'll leave your instructor to give you guidance on that. Now we're going to install some thicker gauge cable. These 2 thick cables go between the contactors and controller. We also have some thicker gauge cable that go between the box and the motor. So we'll take a look at the motor cables. We have motor A1 and motor A2, motor S1 and S2, and these connect between components inside the box and the motor itself. So we need to have them exit the box through the back, and we're going to try to get them positioned such that the length of the cable inside the box matches right up with the component that it's mounting to. So first get them all four started, get them through that opening, and then we'll size them to the points in the box that they need to be attached to. So let's take a look at our forward and reverse contactor setup. And remember that the numbered terminals in these contactors flow according to the way that the copper connects them. So we have 1 connected to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, and then 7 by itself. You just want to leave your cable ends as close to their termination points as possible as you're sending them through the opening in the box. So here we can see this one goes to the controller. This cable that still needs some work to go through goes to contactor point number 1. So we'll just pull that through to match it up. You just got to get it roughly close to where it's going to connect. And do this with all of the termination points. It'll make the assembly much easier. So we'll start with forward and reverse contactor cable number 1. You can see it's clearly labeled, and it goes on to the number 1 position with a washer, lock washer, and then nut, and then we'll tighten it down. So if we count our way across these terminal connections, like the way they're labeled in the image, we can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7. And since 6 is on the bottom, we'll install that one first. It'll be easier to access that way. And then the one above it is number 7. We'll attach that one. And then we'll do forward and reverse contactor cable number 3. This is an internal cable. Goes from the contactors over to the controller. Next, we're going to install the cable control M-. And since this is one of the lower cables, it's also difficult to install. We want to do that before we put on the ones above it. And with connections to the controller, we want to use washers on either side. So we'll put our bolt through with the washer connected, then the cable, then another washer and a lock washer, and then we'll put the nut and connect it down. And here we can see the correct assembly with our cables spaced properly to reach each termination point efficiently as they enter the high voltage box. We have 2 cables that share the post controller B positive. One is a short red cable and the other is a longer motor cable. We'll put these together on this post on either side of it. The other side of the red cable connects to the contactor. Remember, the larger gauge cables go on first, closest to the source. We're also going to add a resistor to the main contactor going across these 2 terminals. And this goes on top of all the other connections across the 2 main posts of the main contactor. This resistor will allow a small amount of electricity to pre-charge the controller. This way we don't get a large inrush of electricity when we turn on the switch and engage the system. We now have our 4 motor cables ready to be attached to the motor when the high voltage control enclosure and the motor are mounted into the vehicle. And the cables will have a small amount of play in them in the event that they have movement during the suspension travel while we operate the vehicle. They're efficiently entering and exiting the box through the sealed opening. You also want to notice that your fans are mounted in opposite positions. One has the label facing out and the other has no label facing, so that we know we have airflow in and out circulating throughout the box. We can now put our battery in the box, the 12-volt auxiliary battery. Make sure you put it in with the positive side on the right side, the correct side. And we'll mount the battery to the box before we make any connections to it. And we have our mounting hardware here. One solid bar goes across the front of the battery and is mounted to the box with 2 bolts, one on either side. You may have to lift up the box a little bit more than normal to get these longer bolts inserted into the bottom of the enclosure. And don't tighten them down one at a time. Tighten each one a little bit at a time so that they tighten evenly and you have a good secure connection with the battery. So with our battery mounted into place, we'll be able now to attach our electrical connections. We're going to do the positive side of the battery first. So we have 3 electrical connections onto the positive terminal of the battery. We'll take a look at them here. The first is the switched power that goes through our system, the relay and the switch when we turn the vehicle on. We have our constant 12 volts that come through the purple wire that provide 12 volts to certain parts of our system constantly. And we have our charging wire that comes from the DC to DC converter that charges the 12-volt battery. So we want to put the wires that carry the most current on closest to the post first. So that will be the charging wire from the DC to DC converter. That'll be first. Then we'll use our switched 12-volt power wire, and then the constant 12-volt purple wire. And then we'll tighten these terminations down with the mounting hardware. Before we do any other connections to the battery, before we connect the negative side, we want to disconnect the DC to DC converter so we don't have a complete circuit as we make these connections. So the 2 connections left for the negative post are the DC to DC converter. That will be the first one. And then the common ground post will be the other. And with the negative post tightened up, we can plug our DC to DC converter back in. And we'll be ready for one more step, and that's to add the fuses. So our final steps in assembling the high voltage box are to insert the fuses in the DIN rail. In our particular setup here, we have 3 fuses that we put in. And this completes our assembly of the wiring of the high voltage control enclosure. We'll be putting the control enclosure into the vehicle and connecting other components to it later on in the assembly sequence.